Question 1. System analysis indicates that a certified investigator is tasked with a complex investigation involving potential financial misconduct within a regulated entity. The investigation has multiple potential avenues of inquiry, varying levels of evidentiary strength, and competing demands on the investigator's time and limited budget. The investigator must decide how to best allocate their resources to ensure a thorough, compliant, and efficient investigation. Which of the following approaches to resource allocation is most consistent with the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) regulatory framework and ethical guidelines? Option A. Focus investigative resources primarily on the most readily available or easily verifiable leads, regardless of their potential significance or regulatory importance. Option B. Distribute resources evenly across all potential investigative avenues to ensure no area is overlooked, even if some avenues have minimal likelihood of yielding significant findings. Option C. Allocate resources based on personal intuition or pre-existing beliefs about the individuals or activities under investigation. Option D. Prioritize investigative efforts based on a systematic risk assessment, regulatory mandates, and the potential impact of findings, ensuring sufficient resources are dedicated to critical areas. Correct answer is D. Prioritize investigative efforts based on a systematic risk assessment, regulatory mandates, and the potential impact of findings, ensuring sufficient resources are dedicated to critical areas. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified investigators, optimizing resource allocation under pressure to meet competing demands while adhering to strict regulatory frameworks. The professional challenge lies in balancing the need for thoroughness and accuracy in investigations with the practical constraints of time, budget, and personnel availability. A failure to allocate resources effectively can lead to compromised investigations, missed critical evidence, regulatory noncompliance, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to prioritize tasks, delegate appropriately, and ensure that all investigative activities are conducted in a manner that upholds the integrity of the process and meets legal and ethical standards. The correct approach involves a systematic and risk-based allocation of resources. This means prioritizing investigative efforts based on the potential impact of the findings, the likelihood of success, and the severity of the alleged misconduct. It requires a clear understanding of the regulatory requirements governing the investigation, ensuring that sufficient resources are dedicated to areas mandated by law or policy. This approach ensures that the most critical aspects of the investigation receive the necessary attention, thereby maximizing the chances of a successful and compliant outcome. An approach that focuses solely on the most visible or easily accessible leads, without a strategic assessment of risk and regulatory mandates, is professionally unacceptable. This can lead to a misallocation of valuable investigative time and resources, potentially overlooking more significant issues, or failing to gather crucial evidence required by regulatory bodies. Such an approach risks violating the investigator's duty of care and diligence, which is often implicitly or explicitly required by professional codes of conduct and regulatory oversight. Another incorrect approach is to allocate resources based on personal bias or preconceived notions about the case. This undermines the objectivity and impartiality that are fundamental to professional investigation. Regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines universally demand that investigations be conducted without prejudice, and resource allocation must reflect this principle. Deviating from this can lead to flawed conclusions, unfair treatment of individuals, and serious legal and ethical repercussions. Furthermore, an approach that neglects to adequately document resource allocation decisions and their rationale is also professionally unsound. Transparency and accountability are key tenets of regulatory compliance. Without proper documentation, it becomes difficult to justify the investigative strategy if challenged, and it hinders the ability to learn from past resource allocation decisions for future improvements. This lack of documentation can be viewed as a failure to adhere to audit trails and oversight requirements. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve 1. Clearly defining the scope and objectives of the investigation, informed by regulatory requirements. 2. Conducting a risk assessment to identify the most critical areas of inquiry. 3. Developing a resource allocation plan that aligns with the risk assessment and regulatory mandates, considering personnel, time, and budget. 4. Regularly reviewing and adjusting the resource allocation plan as the investigation progresses and new information emerges. 5. Ensuring all decisions are documented and justifiable. Question 2. Risk assessment procedures indicate a client is expressing dissatisfaction with the outcome of an investigation, alleging the investigator failed to deliver on specific promised deliverables as outlined in the signed service agreement. The client is demanding a full refund and compensation for perceived losses. As the investigator, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the service agreement and the investigation file to objectively determine if the investigator's actions or omissions constitute a material breach of contract, and then advise the client on potential remedies such as damages or specific performance if applicable. Option B. Advise the client to immediately terminate the contract and demand a full refund, as their dissatisfaction is sufficient grounds for such action. Option C. Recommend that the client disregard the terms of the service agreement and pursue remedies based solely on their subjective feelings of dissatisfaction, irrespective of the contractual obligations. Option D. Suggest the client pursue punitive damages against the investigator, as this will likely result in a substantial recovery for their perceived losses. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the service agreement and the investigation file to objectively determine if the investigator's actions or omissions constitute a material breach of contract, and then advise the client on potential remedies such as damages or specific performance if applicable. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a certified professional investigator, CPI, because it involves navigating a potential breach of contract where the client's expectations, as outlined in the service agreement, may not have been met. The investigator must objectively assess the situation, determine if a breach has occurred according to the terms of the contract, and understand the potential remedies available to the client. Failure to accurately assess the situation could lead to incorrect advice, damage to the professional relationship, and potential liability. The challenge lies in distinguishing between unmet expectations and a legally actionable breach, and in understanding the scope of remedies within the applicable regulatory framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the service agreement to identify the specific obligations of the investigator and the client. This includes examining the scope of work, deliverables, timelines, and any clauses related to performance standards or dispute resolution. If the review reveals that the investigator failed to fulfill a material term of the contract, the investigator should advise the client on the potential remedies available under contract law, such as seeking damages to compensate for losses incurred due to the breach, or potentially seeking specific performance if applicable and feasible. This approach is correct because it is grounded in the fundamental principles of contract law and the investigator's professional duty to act with diligence and competence, adhering to the terms of the engagement. It prioritizes a fact-based assessment of the contractual relationship and the legal recourse available to the client. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the client to immediately terminate the contract and demand a full refund without a thorough review of the service agreement and an objective assessment of whether a material breach occurred is an incorrect approach. This fails to acknowledge the contractual obligations and the legal process for determining a breach and appropriate remedies. It bypasses the necessary due diligence and could lead to unfounded claims or disputes. Suggesting that the client pursue punitive damages without establishing a clear legal basis for such a claim under the contract or relevant law is also an incorrect approach. Punitive damages are typically awarded in cases of egregious misconduct, and their availability is subject to strict legal criteria, which may not be met in a standard contractual dispute. This approach risks providing misleading legal advice, recommending that the client ignore the terms of the service agreement and pursue remedies based solely on their subjective dissatisfaction, regardless of whether the investigator met their contractual obligations, is fundamentally flawed. Contract law requires adherence to agreed-upon terms. This approach disregards the legal framework governing the engagement and could expose both the client and the investigator to negative consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework when faced with potential contract breaches. This framework begins with a clear understanding of the engagement scope as defined by the service agreement. Next, conduct an objective factual investigation to determine if the investigator's actions or omissions constitute a failure to meet contractual obligations. Following this, analyze the legal implications of any identified failures, considering the available remedies under contract law. Finally, provide the client with clear, legally sound advice based on this analysis, always acting within the bounds of professional competence and ethical conduct. Question 3. Examination of the data shows a smartphone containing extensive personal correspondence, financial records unrelated to the alleged crime, and browsing history that includes sensitive medical information. The investigation is authorized by a warrant specifically for evidence related to financial fraud. Which of the following represents the most ethically and legally sound approach for the investigator? Option A. Analyze only the data directly related to financial fraud as specified in the warrant, meticulously documenting any findings. Any other data discovered will be noted but not analyzed or disclosed without further legal authorization. Option B. Analyze all data on the device to ensure no relevant evidence is missed, documenting any potentially incriminating information regardless of its direct relation to financial fraud. Option C. Share the sensitive medical information with a colleague in a different department who specializes in such cases, believing it might be relevant to another ongoing investigation. Option D. Immediately cease analysis of the device and report the discovery of unrelated sensitive data to the authorizing authority for further direction, focusing only on data directly pertaining to financial fraud as per the warrant. Correct answer is B. Analyze all data on the device to ensure no relevant evidence is missed, documenting any potentially incriminating information regardless of its direct relation to financial fraud. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant ethical dilemma for a professional certified investigator, PCI, operating within the U.S. regulatory framework, specifically concerning the analysis of digital devices. The challenge lies in balancing the investigator's duty to uncover relevant evidence with the fundamental right to privacy and the legal limitations on data access. The investigator must navigate the complex interplay of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, the specific rules of evidence governing digital forensics, and the ethical obligations of a PCI to conduct investigations lawfully and impartially. The potential for inadvertently accessing or misinterpreting sensitive, irrelevant, or privileged information necessitates a rigorous and principled approach. The correct approach involves meticulously adhering to the scope of the authorized search warrant or legal consent obtained for the device examination. This means focusing solely on the data directly relevant to the investigation as defined by the legal authorization. Any data discovered that falls outside this scope, even if potentially incriminating or interesting, should be documented but not further analyzed or disclosed without explicit legal authorization or a clear, immediate nexus to the ongoing investigation that falls within the warrant's purview. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant because it respects privacy rights, prevents overreach, and ensures that evidence obtained is admissible in legal proceedings. It aligns with the principles of due process and the exclusionary rule, which can render illegally obtained evidence inadmissible. An incorrect approach would be to broadly analyze all data on the device, regardless of its relevance to the stated purpose of the investigation. This constitutes a violation of privacy rights and potentially exceeds the authority granted by the warrant or consent. Such overreach can lead to the suppression of all evidence found, even relevant evidence, under the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. Another incorrect approach would be to selectively analyze only the data that supports a preconceived notion or hypothesis about the suspect's guilt, ignoring exculpatory evidence. This demonstrates bias and a failure to conduct a thorough and impartial investigation, violating ethical standards of objectivity and fairness. Furthermore, sharing or disclosing any data, even if relevant, to unauthorized individuals or entities without proper legal justification would be a severe breach of confidentiality and potentially illegal. The professional decision-making process for a PCI in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the legal authority under which the examination is being conducted. This includes a thorough review of the search warrant or consent form to define the precise scope of the investigation. Investigators should employ forensically sound methods that preserve data integrity and document every step of the process. When encountering data that appears to fall outside the scope of the authorization, the investigator should consult with legal counsel or the authorizing authority before proceeding with further analysis or disclosure. Maintaining meticulous records of all actions taken and data accessed is crucial for accountability and to defend the integrity of the investigation. Question 4. Assessment of an investigator's approach to interviewing a key witness in a complex fraud investigation, where the investigator aims to elicit detailed financial transaction information while ensuring the witness feels comfortable and unpressured, considering the need for accurate and admissible evidence. Option A. Utilizing leading questions to guide the witness towards specific transaction details and employing a more assertive questioning style to ensure all relevant information is disclosed. Option B. Employing cognitive interviewing techniques such as context reinstatement and encouraging detailed recall, while actively building rapport through active listening and empathetic responses. Option C. Minimizing rapport-building efforts to maintain a professional distance and focusing solely on obtaining factual answers to direct questions. Option D. Focusing exclusively on a chronological questioning sequence, without incorporating memory-enhancing techniques or efforts to build a trusting relationship with the witness. The correct answer is B. Employing cognitive interviewing techniques, such as context reinstatement and encouraging detailed recall, while actively building rapport through active listening and empathetic responses. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the investigator must balance the need to elicit accurate and comprehensive information from a witness with the ethical and regulatory obligations to conduct the interview in a manner that is fair, non-coercive, and respects the witness's rights. The investigator's primary objective is to gather facts relevant to the investigation, but the method employed can significantly impact the reliability of the information obtained and the investigator's professional standing. PCI certification implies adherence to a specific regulatory framework, which in this context, for a U.S.-based exam, would align with principles of due process, fairness, and evidence admissibility, often informed by guidelines from bodies like the Department of Justice or relevant professional investigative associations. The correct approach involves employing cognitive interviewing techniques in conjunction with robust rapport building. Cognitive interviewing, rooted in memory retrieval principles, aims to maximize the amount of accurate information recalled by the witness by using techniques such as context reinstatement, encouraging detailed descriptions, recalling events in different orders, and changing perspectives. Simultaneously, building rapport is crucial for creating a safe and trusting environment, which encourages the witness to be more open and forthcoming. This dual approach is ethically sound and professionally best practice, as it respects the witness's cognitive processes and emotional state, leading to more reliable and complete information without undue pressure. This aligns with the overarching ethical duty of investigators to conduct thorough and unbiased investigations. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on aggressive questioning or leading questions. This fails to build rapport, potentially alienating the witness and hindering their ability to recall information accurately. Leading questions can introduce bias and may result in the witness providing information they believe the investigator wants to hear, rather than what they actually recall, compromising the integrity of the investigation. Another incorrect approach is to neglect rapport building and rely only on a structured, interrogative style. This can create an adversarial atmosphere, making the witness defensive and less likely to volunteer crucial details, thereby limiting the scope and depth of the information gathered. Furthermore, such an approach might be perceived as coercive, potentially leading to challenges regarding the voluntariness and admissibility of any statements obtained, which is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. The professional decision-making process for similar situations requires a deliberate and systematic evaluation of the interview context, the witness's demeanor, and the investigative objectives. Investigators should prioritize techniques that enhance memory recall while simultaneously fostering a collaborative and respectful interaction. This involves continuous assessment of the witness's comfort level and adapting the interview strategy accordingly. Adherence to established investigative protocols and ethical guidelines, which emphasize fairness, accuracy, and the avoidance of coercion, is paramount. Question 5. Which approach would be most ethically sound and procedurally correct for an investigator who discovers a suspect's personal laptop at a crime scene, where immediate access to its contents might seem beneficial for the investigation? Option A. Photograph the laptop in situ, secure it in an anti-static evidence bag, and arrange for immediate transfer to a digital forensics unit for imaging and analysis. Option B. Immediately power on the laptop to conduct a preliminary review of its files and recent activity. Option C. Allow a colleague with general computer knowledge to attempt to access the laptop's data to identify relevant information. Option D. Secure the laptop in a standard evidence bag and transport it to the precinct for later examination. The correct answer is B. Immediately power on the laptop to conduct a preliminary review of its files and recent activity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the investigator's duty to gather evidence and the ethical imperative to maintain the integrity and chain of custody of that evidence. The investigator must balance the urgency of securing potentially crucial information with the meticulous procedures required to ensure its admissibility and reliability in any subsequent proceedings. Failure to adhere to strict protocols can render evidence useless and undermine the entire investigation. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting the discovery of the digital device, securing it in a manner that prevents any alteration or contamination, and immediately initiating the process for forensic imaging by a qualified specialist. This aligns with the principles of evidence handling as outlined in the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) Code of Ethics and relevant investigative guidelines, which emphasize preserving the integrity of evidence from the point of discovery. The immediate transfer to a forensic specialist ensures that the data is extracted using validated methods, minimizing the risk of accidental alteration and maintaining a clear, unbroken chain of custody. This proactive measure safeguards the evidence's evidentiary value and upholds the investigator's professional responsibility. An incorrect approach would be to immediately power on the device to quickly review its contents. This action risks altering the digital state of the device, potentially overriding crucial data or triggering security features that could render the data inaccessible. This violates the principle of preserving evidence in its original state and compromises the chain of custody. Another incorrect approach would be to store the device in a standard evidence locker without any specific precautions for digital media. Digital devices are susceptible to environmental factors like humidity and temperature, and improper storage can lead to degradation or damage, impacting the integrity of the data. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the specific handling requirements for digital evidence. A further incorrect approach would be to allow a non-specialist colleague to attempt to access the data on the device. This introduces a significant risk of mishandling, accidental deletion, or improper data extraction, all of which would severely damage the chain of custody and the evidentiary value of the device. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes evidence integrity and adherence to established protocols. This involves recognizing the unique nature of digital evidence, understanding the critical importance of the chain of custody, and knowing when to engage specialized forensic expertise. The process should involve immediate secure containment, thorough documentation, and prompt transfer to qualified personnel for analysis, ensuring that all actions are justifiable and defensible. Question 6. Implementation of a search for evidence of financial fraud at a suspect's residence, where the investigator has credible information that the suspect is actively shredding documents, presents a critical juncture. What is the most legally sound and procedurally appropriate course of action for the investigator to pursue? Option A. Immediately enter the residence without a warrant to seize the documents being shredded, then seek a search warrant for the remaining evidence. Option B. Inform the suspect that a search warrant is being sought and request their cooperation in preserving the documents. Option C. Contact a supervisor and legal counsel to assess the situation and determine the necessity of obtaining a search warrant based on the specific facts. Option D. Wait for a search warrant to be issued before entering the residence, even if it means the evidence may be destroyed. The correct answer is A. Immediately enter the residence without a warrant to seize the documents being shredded, then seek a search warrant for the remaining evidence. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an investigator to balance the urgent need to gather evidence with the strict legal limitations on search and seizure. The investigator must act decisively to prevent the destruction of evidence, while simultaneously adhering to the procedural safeguards designed to protect individual liberties. Failure to do so can lead to the suppression of crucial evidence, jeopardizing the entire investigation and potentially allowing a perpetrator to evade justice. The investigator's judgment must be informed by a thorough understanding of the relevant legal framework governing search warrants and exigent circumstances. The correct approach involves a meticulous assessment of whether the specific facts and circumstances meet the stringent legal definition of exigent circumstances that would justify a warrantless search. This requires the investigator to have a reasonable belief, based on articulable facts, that evidence is in imminent danger of being destroyed or removed. If such circumstances are present, the investigator may proceed with a warrantless search, but must then promptly seek a search warrant to legitimize the seizure and ensure continued lawful possession of the evidence. This approach prioritizes both the investigative imperative and adherence to constitutional protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with a warrantless search based on mere suspicion or a generalized fear that evidence might be destroyed, without specific, articulable facts to support the imminence of that destruction. This disregards the legal standard for exigent circumstances and violates the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches. Another incorrect approach would be to delay seeking a search warrant after a lawful warrantless entry and seizure, thereby failing to ratify the initial action and potentially rendering the evidence inadmissible. Finally, attempting to create exigent circumstances through deliberate action or inaction to justify a warrantless search is a severe ethical and legal violation. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic evaluation of the facts against established legal standards. Investigators must be trained to recognize the specific indicators of exigent circumstances, document their observations and reasoning meticulously, and consult with legal counsel when in doubt. The primary goal is to gather evidence lawfully, ensuring its admissibility in court and upholding the integrity of the justice system. Question 7. The assessment process reveals that a newly assigned investigator, tasked with a complex fraud investigation, has begun gathering extensive documentation and interviewing numerous individuals without first establishing clear investigative objectives, a defined scope, or a detailed timeline. Which of the following approaches to case management and investigation planning best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations for a certified investigator? Option A. Immediately commence extensive data collection and interviews to gather as much information as possible, believing that a clear picture will emerge organically from the sheer volume of data. Option B. Develop a comprehensive investigation plan that outlines specific objectives, scope, methodology, resource allocation, timelines, and contingency measures, and seek approval before proceeding with extensive data collection and interviews. Option C. Prioritize immediate action and information gathering, assuming that the investigative objectives and scope will become apparent as the investigation progresses. Option D. Focus solely on identifying and interviewing key individuals believed to be directly involved, without a broader plan to understand the systemic nature of the alleged fraud. The correct answer is B. Develop a comprehensive investigation plan that outlines specific objectives, scope, methodology, resource allocation, timelines, and contingency measures, and seek approval before proceeding with extensive data collection and interviews. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an investigator to balance the immediate need for information with the long-term implications of investigative planning, particularly concerning resource allocation and potential legal challenges. The investigator must demonstrate foresight and adherence to established protocols to ensure the investigation is both effective and compliant. The correct approach involves developing a comprehensive investigation plan that clearly defines objectives, scope, methodology, timelines, and resource requirements, while also incorporating contingency planning and risk assessment. This aligns with best practices in case management, emphasizing thoroughness and strategic thinking. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing professional conduct and evidence handling, implicitly or explicitly require such structured planning to ensure investigations are conducted efficiently, ethically, and in a manner that preserves the integrity of evidence and upholds due process. A well-defined plan minimizes scope creep, prevents wasted resources, and provides a clear roadmap for all involved, thereby enhancing the likelihood of a successful and defensible outcome. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate action without a structured plan fails to adequately consider the broader implications. This can lead to inefficient use of resources, missed investigative avenues, and potential challenges to the admissibility of evidence if the investigation is perceived as haphazard or lacking in due diligence. It disregards the fundamental principle of strategic planning essential for complex investigations. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on gathering as much information as possible without clear objectives or a defined scope risks overwhelming the investigation with irrelevant data. This dilutes focus, consumes excessive resources, and can obscure critical findings. It deviates from the principle of targeted and efficient investigation, which is a cornerstone of professional practice. A third incorrect approach that neglects to consider potential legal or ethical challenges during the planning phase is also professionally unsound. Investigations must anticipate and mitigate risks, including those related to privacy, data protection, and the admissibility of evidence. Failing to do so can jeopardize the entire investigation and expose the investigator and their organization to significant liability. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach to investigation planning. This includes 1. Clearly defining the investigative objectives and scope based on initial intelligence or allegations. 2. Identifying all relevant legal and ethical considerations applicable to the jurisdiction. 3. Developing a detailed plan outlining methodologies, resources, timelines, and reporting structures. 4. Incorporating risk assessment and contingency planning. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating the plan as new information emerges or circumstances change. This structured methodology ensures that investigations are conducted with integrity, efficiency, and in full compliance with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 8. During the evaluation of witness statements in a complex fraud investigation, an investigator encounters a statement from a witness who claims another individual, not present at the interview, admitted to forging a document. The investigator believes this statement is highly relevant to proving the forgery. What is the most appropriate course of action regarding this statement? Option A. Record the statement as a factual account of what the witness heard, without further analysis of its evidentiary value, assuming its relevance makes it admissible. Option B. Disregard the statement entirely, as any out-of-court statement cannot be considered evidence in an investigation. Option C. Document the statement as a potential piece of evidence, noting that it is an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, and research applicable exceptions to the hearsay rule for its potential admissibility. Option D. Include the statement directly in the investigative report as factual evidence of the forgery, as the witness appears credible and the information is highly relevant. Correct answer is C. Document the statement as a potential piece of evidence, noting that it is an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, and research applicable exceptions to the hearsay rule for its potential admissibility. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an investigator to navigate the delicate balance between gathering potentially useful information and adhering strictly to the rules of evidence, specifically concerning hearsay. The investigator must exercise sound judgment to avoid compromising the integrity of their investigation or the admissibility of crucial evidence. The correct approach involves meticulously identifying and documenting statements that are offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, and then evaluating whether any exceptions to the hearsay rule apply. This approach is best professional practice because it directly aligns with the fundamental principles of evidence law, ensuring that only reliable and legally permissible information is considered. In the context of the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) exam, which emphasizes adherence to established legal frameworks, this methodical evaluation is paramount. The investigator must demonstrate an understanding that, while a statement might be relevant, its admissibility hinges on whether it constitutes hearsay, and if so, whether an exception permits its introduction. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any statement made by a witness, regardless of its nature, is automatically admissible as long as it seems relevant to the investigation. This fails to recognize the hearsay rule, a cornerstone of evidence law designed to prevent unreliable, out-of-court statements from influencing findings. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss all out-of-court statements without considering potential exceptions to the hearsay rule. This could lead to the exclusion of valuable evidence that, while technically hearsay, falls under a recognized exception, thereby hindering the thoroughness of the investigation. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the perceived credibility of the person making the out-of-court statement as a basis for admissibility, without a legal framework for doing so. Credibility is a separate issue from admissibility, and a statement's truthfulness does not automatically overcome hearsay objections. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the nature of the evidence, e.g., direct observation, document, out-of-court statement. 2. If it's an out-of-court statement, determining if it's being offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted, i.e., is it hearsay? 3. If it is hearsay, researching and applying relevant exceptions to the hearsay rule. And 4. Only then considering the relevance and overall admissibility of the evidence. This structured approach ensures that investigations are conducted ethically and legally, maximizing the chances of presenting sound, admissible evidence. Question 9. Operational review demonstrates that a client suspects an employee of misappropriating company assets. The investigator needs to gather evidence of the employee's activities outside of work hours to determine if these activities are related to the alleged misappropriation. The investigator must choose a surveillance method that is both effective and legally compliant within the specified regulatory framework. Option A. Conduct discrete physical surveillance of the employee in public areas and document their movements and interactions. Option B. Access the employee's private social media accounts without authorization to monitor their posts. Option C. Covertly record conversations the employee has on their personal mobile phone. Option D. Install a GPS tracking device on the employee's personal vehicle without their knowledge or consent. The correct answer is A. Conduct discrete physical surveillance of the employee in public areas and document their movements and interactions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an investigator to balance the need for comprehensive evidence gathering with strict adherence to legal and ethical boundaries, particularly concerning privacy rights. The investigator must select a surveillance method that is both effective in obtaining necessary information and fully compliant with the specified regulatory framework. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of permissible surveillance techniques under the relevant laws and guidelines. The correct approach involves employing physical surveillance methods that are legally permissible and ethically sound, such as discrete observation from public vantage points, or following a subject in a manner that does not infringe upon their reasonable expectation of privacy. This is justified by the regulatory framework, which typically allows for observation of individuals in public spaces where there is no expectation of privacy. Such methods are designed to gather evidence without resorting to intrusive electronic means that could violate privacy laws or ethical standards. An incorrect approach would be to engage in electronic surveillance without proper legal authorization. This could include, for example, covertly recording conversations without consent or using tracking devices on private property without a warrant or explicit permission. Such actions would likely violate privacy statutes and ethical codes governing investigators, leading to the inadmissibility of evidence and potential legal repercussions for the investigator and their firm. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct physical surveillance in a manner that constitutes harassment or stalking, even if technically in a public space. This crosses an ethical line and can lead to legal challenges based on the investigator's conduct, irrespective of the information obtained. Professionals should approach such situations by first thoroughly understanding the scope of their mandate and the specific legal and ethical constraints applicable to their jurisdiction. This involves consulting relevant statutes, case law, and professional conduct guidelines. A risk assessment should be conducted for each potential surveillance method, evaluating its effectiveness against its legal and ethical implications. When in doubt, seeking legal counsel or clarification from regulatory bodies is paramount. The decision-making process should prioritize lawful and ethical conduct, ensuring that any evidence obtained is admissible and that the investigator's actions do not expose themselves or their client to undue risk. Question 10. Performance analysis shows that during an interview, an investigator observes a subject exhibiting increased fidgeting, avoiding direct eye contact, and maintaining a calm, measured tone of voice. The investigator is tasked with determining if these observations, in isolation, are sufficient to conclude the subject is being deceptive, adhering strictly to the PCI regulatory framework and ethical guidelines. Which of the following approaches best reflects the required professional conduct? Option A. Immediately flag the subject as deceptive due to the perceived nervousness indicated by fidgeting and lack of eye contact, and adjust the interview strategy to be more confrontational. Option B. Conclude deception based on the combination of fidgeting and avoidance of eye contact, as these are commonly recognized indicators of nervousness and potential dishonesty. Option C. Recognize that while fidgeting and lack of eye contact can be indicators, they are not definitive proof of deception without corroborating evidence and a baseline comparison. The calm tone of voice is also not a reliable indicator of deception in isolation. Option D. Interpret the calm tone of voice as a sign that the subject is deliberately controlling their emotions to conceal deception, and therefore consider them deceptive. The correct answer is B. Conclude deception based on the combination of fidgeting and avoidance of eye contact, as these are commonly recognized indicators of nervousness and potential dishonesty. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an investigator to balance the need to gather information with the ethical and regulatory obligations to avoid misinterpreting subtle behavioral cues as definitive proof of deception. The Professional Certified Investigator, PCI, designation implies adherence to a strict ethical code and relevant regulatory frameworks, which prioritize accuracy and fairness. Misinterpreting nonverbal cues can lead to wrongful accusations, damage to reputation, and legal repercussions. The correct approach involves a holistic assessment of verbal and nonverbal cues, contextualizing them within the individual's baseline behavior and the overall interview environment. This aligns with PCI ethical guidelines that mandate thoroughness, objectivity, and the avoidance of prejudgment. Regulatory frameworks for investigators often emphasize the need for evidence-based conclusions, meaning that behavioral observations must be corroborated by other factual information. Relying solely on perceived deception cues without supporting evidence is a violation of professional standards. Incorrectly focusing solely on a single nonverbal cue, such as fidgeting, is professionally unacceptable because it ignores the complexity of human behavior and the potential for innocent explanations. This approach lacks objectivity and can lead to confirmation bias, where the investigator seeks evidence to support a preconceived notion of deception. It also fails to consider the individual's baseline behavior. What might be a sign of nervousness for one person could be normal behavior for another. This disregard for individual differences and contextual factors is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Another incorrect approach is to assume that a lack of eye contact definitively indicates deception. This is a common misconception and a gross oversimplification. Many cultural backgrounds and personal anxieties can lead to reduced eye contact, irrespective of truthfulness. Basing an assessment of deception on this single cue without considering other indicators or the individual's baseline is a failure to conduct a comprehensive and objective investigation, violating the principle of evidence-based conclusions. A third incorrect approach is to interpret a calm demeanor as a sign of successful deception. While some individuals may exhibit a calm exterior while being deceptive, a calm demeanor can also be indicative of truthfulness, confidence, or simply a personality trait. To equate calmness with deception is to engage in speculative interpretation rather than objective analysis. This approach fails to acknowledge that deception can manifest in various ways, and a lack of overt signs of distress does not automatically equate to dishonesty. It represents a failure to apply a nuanced and evidence-based investigative methodology. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multifaceted approach. Investigators must first establish a baseline of the subject's normal behavior. They should then observe a range of verbal and nonverbal cues, looking for deviations from this baseline that are consistent with known indicators of deception. Crucially, these observations must be integrated with other evidence gathered during the investigation. If behavioral cues suggest deception, the investigator should seek corroborating evidence before drawing any conclusions. The PCI Code of Ethics and relevant regulatory guidelines on evidence collection and reporting must always guide the process, ensuring that conclusions are objective, fact-based, and ethically sound. Question 11. The monitoring system demonstrates the presence of sensitive client communications that were captured during a period of authorized surveillance. As a professional certified investigator, PCI, what is the immediate and most critical step to take regarding this captured data? Option A. Conduct a thorough review to confirm the legality and scope of the data capture against the authorization and relevant legal frameworks before analyzing its content. Option B. Disregard all captured communications due to potential privacy concerns and inform the client of the system's limitations. Option C. Share the captured communications with external legal counsel for an independent assessment of their admissibility. Option D. Immediately analyze the content of all captured communications to identify relevant evidence. The correct answer is D. Immediately analyze the content of all captured communications to identify relevant evidence. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an investigator to balance the need for thorough evidence gathering with strict adherence to legal frameworks governing data access and privacy. The investigator must act within the bounds of authorized access and avoid any actions that could be construed as unlawful surveillance or data breaches, which could compromise the investigation, lead to legal repercussions, and damage the reputation of the investigative firm and its client. Careful judgment is paramount to ensure the integrity of the investigation and maintain public trust. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the evidence obtained through the monitoring system to determine if it was acquired legally and in accordance with established protocols and the client's explicit authorization. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes lawful evidence collection, a cornerstone of any credible investigation. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of due process and privacy rights, ensuring that any evidence used is admissible in legal proceedings and that the investigator operates within the scope of their mandate. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, which are fundamental to the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) designation. An incorrect approach would be to immediately analyze the content of all data captured by the monitoring system without first verifying the legality and scope of its collection. This is professionally unacceptable because it risks the use of illegally obtained evidence, which is inadmissible and can lead to severe legal penalties, including civil lawsuits and criminal charges. It also violates privacy laws and ethical guidelines that mandate investigators respect individuals' privacy and only access data through authorized means. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the data entirely because of potential privacy concerns without a proper legal assessment. While privacy is important, a complete disregard without due diligence could mean missing crucial evidence that was lawfully obtained. The professional reasoning process should involve a systematic evaluation of the evidence's origin and legality. This includes understanding the specific legal frameworks governing the type of monitoring employed, the scope of client authorization, and the relevant data protection regulations. If the data appears to have been obtained lawfully, the investigator should proceed with analysis. If there are doubts, the investigator must consult legal counsel or relevant authorities to clarify the legal standing before proceeding, thereby ensuring all actions are compliant and ethically defensible. Question 12. The performance metrics show a significant increase in reported incidents of public disorder in a specific downtown sector over the past quarter. To understand the root causes and identify potential perpetrators, an investigator needs to review CCTV footage from private businesses operating within that sector. The investigator believes that accessing this footage immediately is critical to preventing further incidents. What is the most appropriate course of action for the investigator to take regarding the acquisition of the CCTV footage, strictly adhering to the regulatory framework for public safety and security investigations? Option A. Obtain a warrant from a judicial officer to lawfully access and review the private CCTV footage. Option B. Request the CCTV footage from the businesses through informal communication, without disclosing the specific investigative purpose or seeking formal authorization. Option C. Access the CCTV footage directly from the private businesses, citing departmental urgency and a general need for public safety information. Option D. Advise the department to postpone further investigation in that sector until a more direct and legally permissible method of obtaining such footage becomes available. The correct answer is A. Obtain a warrant from a judicial officer to lawfully access and review the private CCTV footage. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an investigator to balance the immediate need for information with the strict legal boundaries governing surveillance and data acquisition. The investigator must exercise careful judgment to ensure all actions are compliant with the specified regulatory framework, preventing potential legal repercussions and compromising the integrity of the investigation. The correct approach involves initiating a formal request for the necessary surveillance data through the established legal channels, specifically by obtaining a warrant. This is the only method that aligns with the regulatory framework governing public safety and security investigations. The legal justification for this approach is rooted in statutes that protect individual privacy and mandate judicial oversight for intrusive investigative techniques. Without a warrant, any evidence obtained through surveillance would be considered illegally obtained and inadmissible in court, potentially jeopardizing the entire investigation and leading to disciplinary action against the investigator. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with accessing the CCTV footage without proper authorization, relying on a perceived urgency or a vague understanding of departmental policy. This fails to adhere to the statutory requirements for lawful data acquisition, specifically the need for judicial authorization, a warrant, for accessing private surveillance data. Such an action constitutes a violation of privacy laws and investigative protocols, rendering any obtained evidence inadmissible and exposing the investigator to legal and professional sanctions. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to obtain the footage through informal channels or by misrepresenting the nature of the request to the CCTV operator. This bypasses the legally mandated process and demonstrates a disregard for due process and established investigative procedures. It undermines the integrity of the investigation and violates ethical standards by employing deceptive tactics. A further incorrect approach would be to delay the investigation indefinitely due to a lack of immediate access without exploring the proper legal avenues. While caution is necessary, an investigator has a professional responsibility to pursue all lawful means to gather evidence. Failing to initiate the warrant process when faced with such a situation represents a dereliction of duty and an inability to effectively manage investigative resources within legal constraints. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the relevant statutes and regulations governing investigative powers. When faced with a need to access sensitive data, the investigator must first identify the legal basis for such access. If statutory authorization, such as a warrant, is required, the investigator must initiate the process to obtain it. This involves consulting with legal counsel or the appropriate prosecuting authority to draft and present the necessary application to a judicial officer. Throughout the process, maintaining meticulous records of all actions taken and communications made is crucial for demonstrating compliance and accountability. Question 13. Process analysis reveals that a professional certified investigator, PCI, is tasked with gathering intelligence on potential internal fraud within a large corporation. The investigator must adopt a persona to gain access to sensitive areas and interact with employees. Which of the following represents the most ethically sound and professionally responsible approach to role-playing and maintaining cover in this scenario? Option A. Assume a persona that allows for the manipulation of employees into revealing information through exaggerated claims of authority or insider knowledge. Option B. Create an elaborate and highly convincing false identity that allows for broad access and interaction, even if it involves minor embellishments of personal history to build rapport. Option C. Develop a credible, pre-approved persona that aligns with a legitimate business function within the organization, and strictly adhere to the established operational plan and ethical guidelines throughout the investigation. Option D. Engage in extensive personal relationships under the guise of the fabricated persona to foster trust and gain deeper insights into employee activities. The correct answer is C. Develop a credible, pre-approved persona that aligns with a legitimate business function within the organization, and strictly adhere to the established operational plan and ethical guidelines throughout the investigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant professional challenge for a certified professional investigator, CPI, due to the inherent tension between the need to gather intelligence and the imperative to maintain operational security and ethical conduct. The investigator must balance the objective of obtaining information with the critical requirement of not compromising their identity or the integrity of the investigation. This requires a nuanced understanding of role-playing techniques, an acute awareness of potential risks, and strict adherence to established ethical guidelines and regulatory frameworks. CPI's judgment is paramount in navigating the fine line between effective undercover work and actions that could lead to legal repercussions, reputational damage, or the failure of the investigation. The correct approach involves adopting a persona that is credible and consistent with the investigative objective, while strictly adhering to pre-approved operational parameters and avoiding any actions that could be construed as entrapment or a violation of privacy laws. This approach prioritizes the integrity of the investigation and the ethical conduct of the investigator. Specifically, under the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) framework, investigators are bound by principles of lawful conduct, respect for individual rights, and the avoidance of deception that could lead to criminal activity. Maintaining a believable cover that facilitates information gathering without crossing ethical or legal boundaries is the hallmark of professional investigative practice. An incorrect approach that involves fabricating a false identity and engaging in deceptive practices to elicit information without clear authorization or a defined ethical boundary poses significant risks. This could lead to accusations of impersonation, fraud, or even criminal liability, depending on the specific nature of the deception and the jurisdiction's laws. Such actions directly contravene the PCI's emphasis on lawful and ethical investigative methods. Another incorrect approach, which involves exaggerating the investigator's fabricated persona to gain trust and access to sensitive information, is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to the investigator inadvertently revealing information they should not, or making commitments on behalf of their fabricated identity that could have legal or financial consequences. It undermines the controlled nature of undercover operations and increases the risk of exposure. A further incorrect approach, that of allowing the fabricated persona to dictate actions beyond the scope of the investigation or to engage in personal relationships under false pretenses, is a severe ethical breach. This not only compromises the investigation, but also violates fundamental principles of honesty and respect for individuals, potentially leading to severe reputational damage for the investigator and the organization they represent. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough risk assessment, clear authorization for the undercover operation, and the establishment of strict operational guidelines. Investigators must continuously evaluate their actions against the PCI's ethical code and relevant legal statutes, ensuring that their role-playing remains a tool for lawful information gathering and does not devolve into unethical or illegal conduct. Regular debriefing and supervision are crucial to maintaining operational integrity and addressing any potential ethical dilemmas that arise during the course of an undercover assignment. Question 14. Governance review demonstrates that an investigator is interviewing a key witness who appears visibly anxious, fidgets frequently, and provides answers that contain minor inconsistencies when initially questioned. The investigator has a strong suspicion that this witness is withholding crucial information. What is the most ethically sound and procedurally correct approach for the investigator to manage this witness and assess their credibility? Option A. Focus exclusively on the witness's body language and perceived discomfort, interpreting these as clear signs of deception and pressing them aggressively for admissions. Option B. Conclude the interview prematurely, deeming the witness unreliable due to their nervousness and inconsistencies, and proceed with the investigation based on other available evidence. Option C. Continue the interview, calmly and patiently seeking clarification on inconsistencies, cross-referencing their statements with other known facts, and observing their overall demeanor without making accusations or assumptions about their truthfulness. Option D. Gently guide the witness towards providing answers that confirm the investigator's suspicions, implying that their cooperation in this manner will expedite the process and be viewed favorably. The correct answer is C. Continue the interview, calmly and patiently seeking clarification on inconsistencies, cross-referencing their statements with other known facts, and observing their overall demeanor without making accusations or assumptions about their truthfulness. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the investigator must balance the need to gather accurate information with the ethical obligation to treat witnesses fairly and maintain their trust. The investigator's actions directly impact the integrity of the investigation and the perceived fairness of the process. Careful judgment is required to avoid compromising the investigation through undue pressure or bias, while also ensuring that all relevant information is obtained and assessed objectively. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough credibility assessment of the witness by cross-referencing their statements with other evidence and observing their demeanor, without employing coercive tactics or making assumptions about their truthfulness. This aligns with the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) ethical guidelines, which emphasize objectivity, fairness, and the pursuit of truth through diligent and unbiased investigation. Regulatory frameworks governing investigations typically mandate that evidence be obtained ethically and that witnesses be treated with respect, avoiding any form of intimidation or manipulation that could lead to unreliable testimony. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the witness's testimony outright due to perceived nervousness or inconsistencies without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge that nervousness can stem from various factors unrelated to deception, and that initial inconsistencies may be resolved through further questioning or corroboration. Ethically, this approach is flawed as it prematurely judges the witness and may lead to overlooking crucial information. Another incorrect approach would be to subtly suggest to the witness that their cooperation is contingent on providing information that aligns with the investigator's pre-existing suspicions. This constitutes a form of undue influence and can lead to fabricated or coerced testimony, undermining the integrity of the investigation and violating ethical principles of impartiality. Such actions could also contravene regulations that prohibit misleading or pressuring witnesses. A third incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the witness's body language and perceived discomfort, interpreting these as definitive indicators of dishonesty. While demeanor can be a factor in credibility assessment, it is not a standalone determinant of truthfulness and can be misleading. Over-reliance on such subjective interpretations without corroborating evidence is unprofessional and ethically unsound, as it risks misjudging the witness and potentially damaging their reputation or the investigation's outcome. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective evidence gathering, systematic analysis of all available information, and a nuanced assessment of witness credibility that considers multiple factors, including consistency, corroboration, and demeanor, while always adhering to ethical principles and relevant regulations. This involves maintaining an open mind, actively seeking to verify or refute statements, and documenting all observations and assessments transparently. Question 15. The control framework reveals a situation where an investigator, conducting an inquiry under UK regulations, has obtained sensitive personal data. A key stakeholder, who is not the data controller, requests access to this data, stating it is crucial for their understanding of the broader context of the investigation. The investigator is considering sharing the data based on the stakeholder's assertion of its importance. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the investigator? Option A. Verify the lawful basis for processing and sharing the personal data, ensuring explicit consent from the data subject or a clear legal obligation exists, and consult the client agreement and relevant data protection legislation before any disclosure. Option B. Share the data with the stakeholder, as their assertion of its importance suggests a legitimate need for the information in the context of the investigation. Option C. Share the data with the stakeholder, assuming that as a party involved in the investigation, they have an implied right to access all relevant information. Option D. Rely on the stakeholder's informal assurance that sharing the data is acceptable, given their involvement in the investigation. Correct answer is A. Verify the lawful basis for processing and sharing the personal data, ensuring explicit consent from the data subject or a clear legal obligation exists, and consult the client agreement and relevant data protection legislation before any disclosure. Explanation. The control framework reveals a potential breach of client confidentiality and data privacy regulations, a common challenge for certified investigators. The scenario demands careful judgment, because investigators often handle sensitive information belonging to multiple parties, requiring a delicate balance between fulfilling their investigative mandate and upholding legal and ethical obligations. The challenge lies in discerning the scope of permissible information sharing and ensuring that all actions align with the specific regulatory framework governing the investigation. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the client agreement and applicable data protection laws to determine the explicit consent or legal basis for sharing the information. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to regulatory requirements, such as those outlined in the UK's Data Protection Act 2018 and the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, if applicable to the context of the PCI exam's jurisdiction. Investigators have a legal and ethical duty to protect personal data, and any disclosure must be justified by consent, legal obligation, or legitimate interest, clearly defined and documented. Sharing the information without verifying the scope of consent or legal authorization constitutes a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach disregards the fundamental principles of data protection, which mandate that data processing must have a lawful basis and that individuals have rights regarding their personal data. Failing to obtain explicit consent or a clear legal basis for disclosure can lead to severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage, and breaches the trust placed in the investigator. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the information is relevant to the investigation, it can be freely shared with any party involved. This overlooks the specific legal and contractual limitations on data handling. Investigators must understand that relevance does not automatically equate to permission for disclosure. This failure violates the principle of data minimization and purpose limitation, core tenets of data protection law, which stipulate that data should only be processed for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes and should not be further processed in a manner that is incompatible with those purposes. A third incorrect approach is to rely on informal assurances from a stakeholder that sharing is acceptable. This is professionally unacceptable as it bypasses formal due diligence and documentation. Regulatory frameworks require demonstrable compliance, not assumptions or verbal agreements that can be easily disputed. This approach fails to establish a clear lawful basis for processing and can lead to unintended breaches of privacy and confidentiality, exposing both the investigator and the client to risk. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the sensitive information in question. 2. Ascertain the source of the information and any associated confidentiality clauses or data protection obligations. 3. Review the client agreement and any specific instructions regarding information sharing. 4. Consult the relevant regulatory framework, e.g., UK Data Protection Act 2018 (GDPR), to understand lawful bases for processing and disclosure. 5. If consent is the basis, verify its scope and validity. If a legal obligation or legitimate interest is the basis, ensure it is clearly established and documented. 6. Seek legal counsel if there is any ambiguity regarding data sharing. 7. Document all decisions and justifications for information sharing. 8. Prioritize data protection and confidentiality at all stages of the investigation. Question 16. Investigation of a potential policy violation by an employee with whom the investigator has a casual acquaintance from a local community group. What is the most appropriate professional conduct and demeanor to adopt? Option A. Slightly adjust interview questions to be less confrontational, given the prior acquaintance, to encourage cooperation. Option B. Focus the investigation primarily on gathering information that supports the employee's innocence, given the personal connection. Option C. Inform the employee of the acquaintance at the outset of the interview to establish a friendly rapport and ensure they feel comfortable sharing information. Option D. Conduct the investigation with strict impartiality, maintaining professional distance and focusing solely on objective evidence and established procedures, without disclosing the acquaintance, unless it directly impacts the investigation's objectivity or is required by policy. The correct answer is D. Conduct the investigation with strict impartiality, maintaining professional distance and focusing solely on objective evidence and established procedures, without disclosing the acquaintance unless it directly impacts the investigation's objectivity or is required by policy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the investigator's duty to conduct a thorough and objective investigation and the potential for personal relationships to influence perception and reporting. Maintaining professional demeanor is paramount to ensuring the integrity of the investigation and upholding the trust placed in certified investigators. The PCI designation signifies a commitment to ethical conduct and adherence to established professional standards, which includes managing personal biases and interactions appropriately. The correct approach involves maintaining a strictly professional and impartial demeanor throughout the investigation, regardless of any prior acquaintance with the subject. This means conducting interviews objectively, gathering evidence without prejudice, and reporting findings accurately and without personal embellishment or omission. This aligns with the core principles of professional conduct expected of a PCI, emphasizing objectivity, integrity, and fairness. Specifically, regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines for professional investigators, such as those often found in professional bodies' codes of conduct, mandate impartiality and the avoidance of conflicts of interest, whether real or perceived. The investigator must act in a manner that demonstrates they are not unduly influenced by personal connections, ensuring the investigation's credibility. An incorrect approach would be to allow the prior acquaintance to influence the investigative process. For instance, adopting a more lenient or less rigorous approach during interviews or evidence gathering because of a personal relationship would constitute a failure of professional duty. This could lead to incomplete or biased findings, undermining the investigation's validity and potentially violating ethical codes that require thoroughness and objectivity. Another incorrect approach would be to disclose the prior acquaintance to the subject during the investigation in a way that suggests preferential treatment or creates an expectation of leniency. This blurs professional boundaries and can compromise the investigator's neutrality. Furthermore, failing to disclose the prior acquaintance to the supervising authority or client, if such disclosure is required by policy or ethical guidelines, would be a significant breach of transparency and professional integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to ethical codes and regulatory requirements. This involves a conscious effort to identify potential conflicts of interest, including personal relationships, and to implement measures to mitigate their impact. A key step is to maintain a clear separation between personal and professional interactions, ensuring that all investigative activities are conducted with the highest degree of objectivity and impartiality. When in doubt, seeking guidance from supervisors or adhering to established protocols for managing such situations is crucial. Question 17. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a more streamlined evidence transfer process could save significant time and resources for the investigative team, but it might involve less granular documentation of each handoff. As an investigator, what is the most appropriate course of action when transferring a critical piece of evidence to a forensic laboratory? Option A. Delegate the evidence transfer to a junior team member with a verbal instruction to be careful, assuming the laboratory will handle the final documentation. Option B. Prioritize meticulous step-by-step documentation of every transfer, including the name of the handler, date, time, and purpose, even if it takes longer, to ensure the integrity and admissibility of the evidence. Option C. Store the evidence in a temporary, unlocked office drawer until the laboratory courier arrives to pick it up, to avoid delays in the courier's schedule. Option D. Transfer the evidence to the laboratory without a written record of the transfer, relying on the laboratory's internal tracking system to account for its receipt. The correct answer is B. Prioritize meticulous step-by-step documentation of every transfer, including the name of the handler, date, time, and purpose, even if it takes longer, to ensure the integrity and admissibility of the evidence. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an investigator to balance the immediate need for evidence with the long-term integrity of that evidence. The investigator must make a critical decision under pressure, knowing that a mistake could render crucial evidence inadmissible, jeopardizing the entire investigation and potentially leading to a miscarriage of justice. The core of the challenge lies in adhering strictly to established protocols for handling evidence, even when expediency might seem tempting. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting every step of the evidence handling process, from collection to storage and transfer. This includes clearly labeling the evidence, recording who handled it, when, where, and for what purpose, and ensuring it is stored securely to prevent tampering or contamination. This rigorous adherence to chain of custody procedures is mandated by the governing regulatory framework for investigators, which emphasizes the preservation of evidence integrity to ensure its admissibility in legal proceedings. Failure to maintain a proper chain of custody can lead to the exclusion of evidence, as it raises doubts about its authenticity and reliability. Ethical obligations also demand that investigators act with integrity and diligence, ensuring that the evidence they collect is handled in a manner that upholds the principles of justice. An incorrect approach would be to delegate the transfer of evidence to an untrained individual without proper documentation. This introduces significant risk of procedural errors, such as inadequate labeling, improper packaging, or a break in the documented chain of possession. Such lapses can be exploited by opposing counsel to challenge the evidence's reliability, leading to its exclusion. Another incorrect approach would be to store the evidence in an unsecured location temporarily to save time. This directly violates the principle of maintaining evidence integrity and security, opening the door to potential contamination, loss, or tampering, all of which would compromise the evidence and the investigation. Finally, failing to record the transfer of evidence to a laboratory for analysis, even if the transfer itself is physically secure, creates a gap in the documented chain of custody. This gap can be as damaging as physical tampering, as it prevents a clear accounting of who had access to the evidence and when, thereby undermining its legal standing. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to established protocols and regulatory requirements above all else when handling evidence. This involves a proactive approach to understanding and implementing chain of custody procedures, anticipating potential challenges, and always erring on the side of caution and thorough documentation. When faced with time constraints or perceived inefficiencies, investigators must remind themselves of the fundamental purpose of chain of custody, to guarantee the integrity and admissibility of evidence. If a deviation from protocol seems necessary, the investigator must first consult relevant regulations and supervisors to ensure any such deviation is permissible and meticulously documented, rather than proceeding unilaterally. Question 18. Strategic planning requires an investigator to anticipate potential ethical and legal challenges. Imagine you are conducting a sensitive corporate investigation for a client who has expressed a strong desire for a specific outcome, even suggesting ways to subtly influence the evidence to support their preferred conclusion. What is the most appropriate course of action for a professional certified investigator, PCI, in this situation? Option A. Ignore the client's suggestions and continue the investigation without addressing the ethical concerns, assuming the client will understand the investigator's professional independence. Option B. Politely but firmly refuse to engage in any action that could compromise the integrity of the investigation or violate legal and ethical standards. Clearly communicate these limitations to the client and propose alternative, lawful methods to achieve their legitimate objectives. Option C. Proceed with the investigation as directed by the client, subtly incorporating their suggestions to influence the evidence without outright fabrication, to maintain a positive client relationship. Option D. Directly comply with the client's suggestions to manipulate the evidence, as the client is paying for the investigation and has the right to dictate its direction and outcome. The correct answer is B. Politely but firmly refuse to engage in any action that could compromise the integrity of the investigation or violate legal and ethical standards. Clearly communicate these limitations to the client and propose alternative, lawful methods to achieve their legitimate objectives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's directive and the investigator's ethical and legal obligations. The investigator must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure that their actions do not compromise the integrity of the investigation or violate applicable regulations. Careful judgment is required to balance client expectations with the need for objective and lawful conduct. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to the PCI's Code of Professional Conduct and relevant legal frameworks, even when it conflicts with a client's immediate wishes. This means refusing to engage in any action that could be construed as unethical or illegal, such as fabricating evidence or misrepresenting findings. The investigator must clearly communicate the limitations imposed by ethical and legal standards to the client and propose alternative, lawful methods to achieve the client's legitimate objectives. This aligns with the PCI's commitment to integrity, objectivity, and lawful practice, as well as any specific regulatory requirements governing investigators in the relevant jurisdiction, assuming U.S. federal regulations for this exam context, such as those pertaining to evidence handling and reporting. An incorrect approach would be to comply with the client's request to manipulate findings. This directly violates the PCI's ethical duty of honesty and integrity and could lead to legal repercussions for the investigator and the client, including charges related to obstruction of justice or fraud. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the client's request and proceed with the investigation without addressing the ethical dilemma. This demonstrates a lack of professional communication and an abdication of responsibility to manage client expectations and potential conflicts. Finally, an approach that involves subtly implying the desired outcome without outright fabrication, while seemingly less egregious, still compromises objectivity and can be considered a form of professional misconduct, as it misleads the client and potentially others who rely on the investigation's findings. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the ethical and legal implications of any client request. This involves consulting the PCI's Code of Professional Conduct and any applicable statutes or regulations. If a request appears to violate these standards, the professional should clearly articulate the boundaries to the client, explaining the ethical and legal reasons for refusal. The next step is to explore alternative, ethical, and lawful means to assist the client in achieving their legitimate goals. This proactive and transparent communication is crucial for maintaining professional integrity and managing client relationships effectively. Question 19. When evaluating the planning and execution of an undercover operation, which approach best demonstrates adherence to the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) regulatory framework and ethical standards for evidence gathering? Option A. Proceeding with the operation after obtaining all necessary judicial authorizations and establishing comprehensive safety and communication protocols. Option B. Relying on the investigator's professional judgment and experience to conduct the operation without formal documentation or external legal review. Option C. Initiating surveillance and intelligence gathering immediately to gather critical information, with the intention of seeking legal authorization retrospectively. Option D. Commencing the operation based on a verbal agreement from a superior officer, without formal written authorization or documented operational plans. Correct answer is A. Proceeding with the operation after obtaining all necessary judicial authorizations and establishing comprehensive safety and communication protocols. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant professional challenge due to the inherent risks and legal complexities associated with planning and executing undercover operations. The investigator must balance the need to gather intelligence effectively with the absolute imperative to adhere strictly to the governing regulatory framework, which in this context is the Professional Certified Investigator (PCI) exam's specified jurisdiction. Failure to do so can result in the inadmissibility of evidence, civil liability, and severe reputational damage. The core challenge lies in ensuring that every step of the operation, from initial planning to final debriefing, is legally sound, ethically defensible, and demonstrably compliant with PCI standards. The correct approach involves a meticulous, documented process that prioritizes legal authorization and operational security. This includes obtaining all necessary warrants or judicial authorizations prior to commencing any intrusive investigative activity, clearly defining the scope and objectives of the undercover operation, and establishing robust protocols for agent safety, evidence handling, and communication. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the PCI's emphasis on lawful investigation and due process. Specifically, it upholds the principles of judicial oversight and the protection of individual rights, ensuring that the operation is conducted within the bounds of established law and ethical investigative practice. The detailed planning and documentation serve as a crucial defense against potential legal challenges and demonstrate a commitment to professional integrity. An incorrect approach that involves initiating surveillance and intelligence gathering without first securing the requisite legal authorization, such as a warrant or court order, is professionally unacceptable. This failure directly contravenes fundamental legal principles regarding privacy and search and seizure, potentially rendering any gathered evidence inadmissible in court. Another incorrect approach, which is to proceed with the operation based solely on the investigator's personal assessment of necessity, without formal approval from a supervising authority or legal counsel, represents a significant ethical and regulatory breach. This bypasses essential checks and balances designed to prevent overreach and abuse of investigative powers. Furthermore, an approach that neglects to establish clear protocols for agent safety and communication during the operation, even if legally authorized, demonstrates a disregard for the well-being of personnel and operational integrity, which is a core ethical responsibility for any investigator. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the proposed operation against the governing legal and ethical framework. Investigators must proactively identify potential legal hurdles and ethical considerations, consult with legal counsel when necessary, and ensure that all actions are documented and justifiable. Prioritizing lawful authorization, operational security, and personnel welfare are paramount. Question 20. The performance metrics show a consistent need to improve confession rates in sensitive interviews. An investigator is tasked with interviewing a suspect in a complex financial fraud case. The investigator is aware that the suspect is under significant personal and financial stress. Which of the following interview approaches best aligns with professional ethical standards and legal requirements for investigators operating under U.S. federal and state law? Option A. Suggesting to the suspect that cooperating fully and providing a confession will likely result in a significantly reduced sentence or favorable treatment from the authorities. Option B. Threatening the suspect with immediate arrest and severe legal penalties if they do not provide a confession within a specified time frame. Option C. Employing a structured interview technique that focuses on building rapport, using open-ended questions to encourage detailed responses, and clearly informing the suspect of their rights, while avoiding any form of coercion or misrepresentation of evidence. Option D. Presenting fabricated evidence of the suspect's guilt to create a sense of inevitability and pressure them into confessing. The correct answer is C. Employing a structured interview technique that focuses on building rapport, using open-ended questions to encourage detailed responses, and clearly informing the suspect of their rights, while avoiding any form of coercion or misrepresentation of evidence. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an investigator to balance the need to gather information effectively with strict adherence to legal and ethical boundaries during an interview. The investigator must recognize that, while obtaining a confession or critical admission is a primary goal, the methods employed must not violate an individual's rights or compromise the admissibility of evidence. The pressure to achieve positive outcomes, as indicated by performance metrics, can tempt an investigator to overstep these boundaries, leading to significant legal and professional repercussions. The correct approach involves employing a structured, non-coercive interview technique that respects the interviewee's rights, such as the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel, as established by relevant U.S. federal and state laws, e.g., Miranda v. Arizona, Fifth Amendment protections. This approach prioritizes obtaining truthful and voluntary statements by building rapport, using open-ended questions, and allowing the interviewee to speak freely without undue pressure or deception. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing law enforcement and private investigations, mandate that interviews be conducted ethically and legally to ensure the integrity of the investigation and any subsequent legal proceedings. An incorrect approach that involves making promises of leniency or implying that cooperation will lead to a lighter sentence is ethically and legally flawed. Such tactics can render any resulting confession involuntary and inadmissible in court, violating due process rights and potentially leading to the suppression of crucial evidence. Furthermore, it breaches professional ethical codes that prohibit misrepresentation or coercion. Another incorrect approach, such as threatening the interviewee with negative consequences if they do not cooperate, constitutes coercion and intimidation. This directly violates an individual's right against self-incrimination and can lead to the same legal challenges as making false promises. It undermines the investigator's credibility and the integrity of the investigative process. Finally, an approach that involves misrepresenting the evidence to the interviewee in a manner that is likely to elicit an untrue statement is also problematic. While some forms of deception may be permissible in certain investigative contexts, outright fabrication of evidence or misleading statements about guilt can cross legal and ethical lines, potentially leading to a confession that is not voluntary and therefore inadmissible. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of applicable laws and ethical guidelines. Investigators must prioritize lawful and ethical conduct over immediate results. This includes conducting pre-interview legal and ethical reviews, employing evidence-based interview techniques, and continuously assessing the voluntariness of statements. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel or supervisors is paramount to ensure compliance and maintain the integrity of the investigation.